In this tutorial, we extract image metadata using the image info endpoint. The way it works is you send an image to the image info endpoint, and then the DynamicPDF Cloud API processes that image and extracts the image's metadata, and then it returns it as JSON. The DynamicPDF API has client libraries for Node.js, .NET, Java, PHP, Go, and Python. Click Login and log in to the portal. You must first have a DynamicPDF API account before you can complete this tutorial. You can sign up using your Google or Microsoft account, or you can create a local account. But I already have an account, so I'm going to log in to the DynamicPDF API. After logging into the portal, you're first taken to the dashboard. Now navigate to the File Manager, and then select Add Samples to open the Add Sample dialog. Now check the Get Image Information sample. Click Add to add the sample to your Samples folder. And the sample is added to the Samples folder. Go ahead and download DynamicPDF logo.png to your local file system. After downloading, I move the files to the following folder. I assume this path for the remainder of the tutorial. Now let's consider the endpoint. Go to Documentation, User's Guide, API, REST API, Image Info. The Image Info endpoint takes a POST request and it has the authorization and content type as header parameters. And then in the request body, it sends the binary of the image that you want to process. The endpoint supports the following image content types. We want to run it in Postman, so click the Run in Postman button. It asks us if we want to simply view the collection, import a copy, or fork the collection. Okay, Postman wants me to log in, so I log in. Let's leave the fork label as is and accept the workspace. Click the button and fork the collection. It then forks the project. Click Environments, then click DynamicPDF API. Okay, we need to set the API key, return to the portal, and go to API keys. Copy the API key to your clipboard. Return to Postman. Post the key in the current value property. Persist and then save the modified environment. Now go to Collections and select Image Info Template. Before we do anything else, let's change the environment. Go up here to the right and change the environment to DynamicPDF API. Click on Body to go to the body, click Select File, and we want a new file from our local machine. And let's select the file, DynamicPDF logo.png. Now go to Headers, and we need to change the content type to PNG. Click on Body to go to the body. Okay, now click Send. And it processed the image and returned the image information. Now let's use the DynamicPDF .NET client library with endpoint. I assume that you have already downloaded the .NET Client Examples project from GitHub. And I assume that you have opened it in Visual Studio. Let's start by first building the solution. Go ahead and build the solution. Wait for it to build. Then open the Image Info project and open Program. Notice the using statement using DynamicPDF client library examples. Now check dependencies, and we see that the DynamicPDF client library example project is added as a dependency. Also, notice the DynamicPDF client library was added, and it's the latest version. Okay, so now back in program, first we set the base path. This is the path where we're going to get the image from. Let's go ahead and make sure the image is there. And it's there. And there's the API key. And of course, we're getting the API key from the portal. And then the project's main method calls the imageinfo.example.run method, which is actually in the DynamicPDF library examples. So let's go ahead and go to it. Remember, we had two images in our resources, so we're going to process both the images. So we have two different methods here. First, we create an image resource instance. Then we create an image info instance passing the image resource. Then we set the API key. Then we call the process method and wait for it to return, and it returns the image response. From the response, we get the JSON content. For the second image, we do the same thing, only instead of getting a PNG like we did in the first image, we're going to get a multi-page TIFF. We create an image info instance from the image resource. Of course, we set the API key. Then we call the process method. After it's processed, from the response, we get the JSON content, and we print it to the console. Okay, let's go ahead and run the example. And there you go. Both images were processed by the endpoint. Let's consider the example using the Java client library. I assume you've downloaded the DynamicPDF API examples project from GitHub and imported it to Eclipse as a Maven project. After opening the project, open the POM file. Now let's check that the DynamicPDF client library version is the latest. Okay, we navigate to Sonatype and look up the client library and ensure the version's the latest. And it is, so we're okay. Right-click on the POM and run Maven build to build the jar file. Right-click, run as Maven build. Wait for it to build. After it's done building, open the file getimageinfo.java. The main method calls the run method, passing the API key and base directory. Now let's go to DynamicPDF Cloud API examples and review the properties. The API key is set in the DynamicPDF Cloud Examples class. This class is used for running all the examples at once if you wish to. Of course, we're just running our one isolated example, so we're just getting global variables from this class. The API key is, of course, your key in cloud storage that you get that you get from the apps and API keys in the portal. It also has a base directory and output path as global variables. Let's go ahead and make sure the image is there. And it's there. Returning to getImageInfo, we see the run method takes the API key in the base path. It then creates a new image resource instance. And then we create a new image-info instance passing the image resource. We set the API key. We call the process method and get the response. If it's successful, we print the JSON content to our terminal. Otherwise, we print out the error. Now let's run getImageInfo as a Java application. Right-click, run as Java application. And the image is processed and the metadata is returned from the endpoint. Let's consider the example using the Node.js client library. I assume you downloaded the Node.js client examples project from GitHub. I also assume you obtained the client library using npm and that you have the project opened in Visual Studio Code. Open the getImageInfo.js file. First, it creates a new image resource from the gettingstarted.png image. Let's go ahead and make sure that image is in our resources folder. And it is, so we're okay. After loading the image into the image resource, it then creates a new image info instance, passing the image resource instance. It sets the API key, and of course the API key is coming from our portal. Then the image info endpoint calls its process method, and it waits for it to process, and then it returns an image response after it's done processing. If it's successful, it logs the JSON to the console. Otherwise, it logs the error message. And then we add the code await getImageInfo.run, which will run when we invoke it from the command line. So in the terminal, type node getImageInfo.js, hit return, and the image is processed, and the metadata is returned from the endpoint. Let's consider the example using the PHP client library. I assume you obtained the PHP client library from GitHub, and that you have installed the DynamicPDF API client library using Composer, and that you have the project opened in Visual Studio Code. Open the getImageInfo.php. It first has a public static function run that takes the API key in the path. Now in the PHP example, it gets the path from DynamicPDF examples.php, so let's open it. And there's the API key, which of course is coming from the apps and API key panel in the portal. And then it sets the base path and the output path. Let's go ahead and make sure that image is in our resources folder. And it is, so we're okay. You don't have to worry about the rest of this code. This is just if you wanted to run all examples at once. We don't want to here. Now let's go ahead and comment out DynamicPDF examples run. That's so that this won't be run when we invoke it from the command line. Now return to getImageInfo.php, and you can see the first thing we do is get the image resource from the local path. And then we create a new image info instance passing the image resource. We set the API key. We call the process method and get the response. If it's successful, we print the JSON content to our terminal. Otherwise, we print out the error. And then at the bottom, it has the code that calls the getImageRun method. In the terminal, type php getImageInfo.php. Hit return, and the image is processed, and the metadata is returned from the endpoint. Let's consider the example using the Python client library. I assume you've downloaded the Python client examples from GitHub. I also assume that you've installed the DynamicPDF API using pip, and that you have the project opened in Visual Studio Code. Open the imageinfo.example.py file. It defines a method, imageinfo, which passes an API key in the full path. Go ahead and open shared.py, and we see the API key. This API key is, of course, coming from our portal. Then it sets the base path and the output path. Notice, okay, so let's go ahead and check to make sure the resource is there. And there it is, so we're okay. Return to imageinfo example. Okay, now in the imageinfo example file, it first defines the image_info function, taking an API key in the path, and in that function, it creates a new image resource using the path and resources, Then it creates an image info instance passing the image resource, then it sets the API key, then it calls the process method, and then it prints the JSON response. Then down here at the bottom, it just specifies if this is the main method for this file, go ahead and execute image info. Now in the terminal, type Python imageinfoexample.py, hit return, and the image is processed and the metadata is returned from the endpoint. Let's consider the example using the Go client library. I assume you've downloaded the Go client examples from GitHub. I also assume you've downloaded the DynamicPDF client API for Go using the following go get command, and that you have the project opened in Visual Studio Code. Open imageinfoexample.go. In this method, we're running two different examples, one that takes a PNG and one that takes a multi-page TIFF. Let's go ahead and make sure the images are there. And it's there. In the first method, it first creates a new image resource with the resource path. It sets the base URL. Then it sets the API key. This API key is, of course, coming from our portal. Then it calls a process method. If successful, it prints out the JSON to the terminal. The second method's processing is the same as the first, only it processes a multi-page TIFF rather than a PNG. Now let's run the example in the terminal. Okay, in the terminal, type go run imageinfoexample.go. Hit return. And it returns the JSON from both images. And that's the DynamicPDF API's image info endpoint. As you can see in the image info endpoint, the processing is similar for all the client libraries. First, it creates a new image resource from the image. Then it creates a new image information endpoint, loading the image resource. Then it calls the image information endpoint and returns the image's information as JSON. I'm James, developer evangelist at DynamicPDF, reminding you, when you think PDF, think DynamicPDF API. See you next time.